Hi everybody, I thought you might like a nice shot of Ruby's massive butt today, just before I read a part of Kate DiCamillo's The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. Chapter 19 of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, and it begins with a picture of him lying face down on the floor. Things not looking so good again for this poor China rabbit. The days passed, the sun rose and set and rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he did not care. I think they're becoming soggy because the little girl who is with him now is sucking on them. His sweater had almost completely unravelled and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death and it felt good. In the evenings at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. Remember, they've turned him into a puppet. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh no," said Bryce. "Oh honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she is gone. How could this be?" he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and the son continued. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Chapter 20. There we go. See what's going on now. Still seems to be a puppet. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I've seen. 1. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right there on the street corner and people pay for them. I seen it." The walk to town took all night. Bryce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back, the feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden, the feeling that nothing mattered and that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother, "dirty." She pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said, and then after a long pause he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time, finally put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep dark eyes. "Pellegrina?" thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You've got your wish. I have learned how to love. And it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't going to cry any more." Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and looked inside it. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." Chapter 21. They're going to have something to eat at the diner. The diner was called Neil's. The word was written in big red neon letters that flashed on and off. Inside it was warm and bright and smelled like fried chicken and toast and coffee. Bryce sat at the corner and put Edward on a stool next to him. He leaned the rabbit's forehead up against the counter so that he would not fall. "What are you going to have, sugar?" the waitress said to Bryce. "Give me some pancakes," said Bryce, "and some eggs, and I want steak too. I want a big old steak and some toast and some coffee." The waitress leaned forward and pulled at one of Edward's ears and then pushed him backward so that she could see his face. "This your rabbit?" she said to Bryce. "Yes'm, he's mine now. He belonged to my sister." Bryce wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "We're in show business now, me and him, this rabbit." "Is that right?" said the waitress. She had a name tag on the front of her dress. "Marlene," it said. She looked at Edward's face and then she let go of his ear and he fell forward so that his head rested against the counter again. "Go ahead, Marlene," thought Edward. "Push me around. Do with me as you will. What does it matter? I am broken. The food came and Bryce ate all of it without even looking up from his plate. "Well, you was hungry for sure," said Marlene as she cleared away the plates. "I reckon show business is hard work." "Yes'm," said Bryce. Marlene tucked the cheque under the coffee cup. The cheque is the bill in America. Bryce picked it up and looked at it and then shook his head. "I ain't got enough," he said to Edward. "Ma'am," he said to Marlene when she came back and filled his coffee cup, "I ain't got enough money." "What, sugar?" "I ain't got enough money." She stopped pouring the coffee and looked at him. "You're going to have to talk to Neil about that." Neil, it turned out, was both the owner and the cook. He was a large, red-haired, red-faced man who came out of the kitchen holding a spatula in one hand. You came in here hungry, right?" he said to Bryce. "Yes, sir," said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "And you ordered some food and I cooked it and Marlene brought it to you, right?" "I reckon," said Bryce. "You reckon," said Neil. He brought the spatula down on the countertop with a thwack. Bryce jumped. "Yes, sir. No, sir." "I cooked it for you," said Neil. "Yes, sir," said Bryce. He picked Edward up off the floor, off the stool, and held him close. Everyone in the diner had stopped eating. They were all staring at the boy and the rabbit and Neil. Only Marlene looked away. "You ordered it, I cooked it, Marlene served it, you ate it. Now," said Neil, "I want my money." He tapped the spatula lightly on the counter. Bryce cleared his throat. "You ever seen a rabbit dance?" he said. "How's that?" said Neil. "You ever before in your life seen a rabbit dance?" Bryce set Edward on the floor and started pulling the strings attached to his feet, making him do a slow shuffle. He put his harmonica in his mouth and played a sad song that went along with the dance. Somebody laughed. Bryce took the harmonica out of his mouth and said, "He could dance some more if you want him to. He could dance to pay for what I ate." Neil stared at Bryce and then without warning he reached down and grabbed hold of Edward. "This is what I think of dancing rabbits," said Neil, and he swung Edward by the feet, swung him so that his head hit the edge of the counter. There was a loud crack. Bryce screamed and the world, Edward's world, went black.